Hi class, this is Dr. Heather Austin Robillard, and this lecture is going to be about food addiction. We have recently started the process of learning about eating disorders that are associated with being overweight or obesity. In the last lecture, we discussed night eating syndrome and binge eating disorder. Food addiction is another disorder that is not recognized by the APA. However, there has been a body of research to support the consideration of food addiction as a legitimate mental health disorder that people often struggle with. In this lecture, you will learn about food addiction and how it is defined, how it presents clinically, and how food addiction fits into the addiction framework. On this slide, you see a picture of cookies. Often someone with food addiction will say the following and fill in the blank. For this, I'm going to put cookies. I saw cookies and I thought, that looks really good. I thought I should buy some cookies. But then I decided, no, I'm not going to do it. For 2 weeks, I did nothing but think about those cookies. And finally, I bought it. I told myself I will just have one cookie. And I ended up eating the whole box of cookies in less than 2 days. This is an example of what someone who struggles with a food addiction might go through. You can fill in the blank with any food that a person who struggles with food addiction might be susceptible to. It could be chips, popcorn, other sweets, anything that they try to hold back on how much they're eating of it, but they end up being somewhat obsessed with it and then lose control. It is estimated that about 5.4% of the general population might struggle with food addiction. Female prevalence rates are a little bit higher at 6.7%, with males being at 3% prevalence rates of struggling with food addiction. What we do know is that as someone's BMI increases, their food addiction symptoms tend to increase as well. Individuals who struggle with food addiction can be at a normal weight and still report that they're struggling. What we know about the age of someone who struggles with food addiction is that the research shows they're a little bit older than some of the other eating disorders, typically 20 and older. The younger individuals who do struggle with food addiction tend to lean towards snack foods like chips, ice cream, cookies, whereas the older individuals who report struggling with food addiction have a preference for meals like steak, burgers, and casseroles. When it comes to gender, men report more likely to seek out comfort meals, whereas women report more likely to seek out sweets for their comfort. Those who struggle with food addiction tend to have a family influence of conflict, a family history of mental illness, including substance use disorders or other eating disorders, and their family tends to have negative messages around food that end up affecting someone who struggles with food addiction. Again, some of the food preferences that individuals struggling with food addiction have include junk food like candy, ice cream, cakes, cookies, or high-carb foods like chips, pizza, french fries, and pasta. Before we talk about what is food addiction, I want you to take a moment and think about the things that you hear on television, radio, in books, or other advertisements that allude to having a food addiction. Think about the statement, once you pop, you just can't stop. Or, I bet you just can't eat one. Those common advertisement tools tend to influence people to have a food addiction. These advertisements imply that certain foods have addictive properties and that people can become addicted to them. The term food addiction first appeared in literature in 1955. And while there's still no universal definition or general consensus on whether or not food addiction is a clinical diagnosis, we do know that it has certain criteria. One, it's an abnormal pattern of excessive consumption. It proposes that addictive food is composed of food combinations that do not occur in nature. They're typically highly palatable foods or foods that are rich in sugar, fat, and salt. These highly palatable foods trigger the reward and pleasure centers of our brain, just like those with drugs. The signal overrides the signals that we have for fullness and satisfaction in our body. and the brain will continue to light up, signaling wanting, but over time the brain gets less satisfied from consuming these foods, which then leads us to want to overeat and eating alone and eating at night. So, what does food addiction look like? Somebody with a food addiction might have cravings for certain foods. They often eat more than intended. They eat to the point of feeling excessively stuffed, think, Thanksgiving dinner, feeling guilty after eating foods, yet eat them again soon after. They make excuses about eating something one is craving, like I just had a really bad day, I need this. Repeatedly trying to quit or setting rules but are unsuccessful. They hide consumption of unhealthy foods from others, and they're unable to control consumption of unhealthy foods despite causing physical harm, including weight gain. This is one scale that looks at assessing for food addiction. The Yale Food Addiction Scale is a validated measure of food addiction that was developed by researchers at Yale. It is 25 questions long, and it's a Likert scale, so 0 meaning never, up to 4, that is 4 more times a day. They have 2 additional questions that inquire about types of foods that the individual might struggle with. And it's based on the DSM-4 criteria for substance use disorder. There is 8 criteria recognized in the Yale Food Addiction Scale, 7 behavioral indicators of food addiction, and some clinical impairment. Questions that are included in the Yale Food Addiction Scale include, I find that when I start eating certain foods, I end up eating much more than I planned. I eat to the point where I feel physically ill. Not eating certain types of food or cutting down certain types of food is something I worry about. My food consumption has caused significant psychological problems such as depression, anxiety, self-loathing, or guilt. This slide discusses some of the behavioral indicators of food addiction. The first list are those behavioral indicators that have been empirically supported through research. We know that individuals who struggle with food addiction have a feeling of loss of control. They have multiple attempts at reducing or stopping their food behaviors, and they continue to eat these foods despite having physical or psychological problems. There is also a list of indicators that we need a little bit more research in. One is the tolerance, meaning we need more of the type of food in order to give us a similar reward, similar reward in our brain. There's the withdrawal, if you've ever tried to cut out sugar, feeling those withdrawal symptoms. The spending a great deal of time on activities to obtain, use, or recovery from their food addiction. And other important activities are given up in order to eat those foods. There are lots of psychological similarities between alcohol and food. People who abuse both tend to have behavioral control issues, like they're impulsive, they like to seek novelty or new experiences. They share motives for use, like using the substance as a reward for stress reduction or for a negative emotion management or coping. This picture shows imaging of both control groups of non-addicted individuals and addicted individuals. You will see that there are neurotransmitter functioning changes between the 2 groups. Progressive use of substance creates tolerance, which means needing more and more of a substance to get a desired response. This is seen in brain processing as downregulation of a neurotransmitter receptor. When our brain receives dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter, which is released when you have sex or use drugs, these receptor sites receive those. When too much is released, the receptor sites will downregulate, meaning less of the neurotransmitter dopamine will be taken into the cell. This is an attempt to keep a balanced level of the neurotransmitter after excessive stimulation has occurred due to the drug use. Once the drug is out of the system, the body is receiving a lot less dopamine because of the reduction in receptor sites. This causes less pleasure to be felt by individual using. Dopamine, which is released in excess following drug use, is also released in higher amounts in response to the consumption of some processed foods, particularly sugary foods. We see the same process of dopamine downregulation of the cell in the brains of those who are obese and those who have used cocaine. Highly palatable foods light up our key reward pathways activated in drug and alcohol addiction. In this lecture, you learned about the emerging topic in the field, which is food addiction. Food addiction describes abnormal patterns of excessive consumptions of foods, particularly those that are highly palatable to us. These highly palatable, refined foods trigger the reward and pleasure pathways within our brain. This mechanism is similar to the triggers that drugs and alcohol play in a person's brain. Despite the growth in research in this topic, food addiction is not recognized by the APA as an actual mental illness. Individuals who identify as having a food addiction will experience intense cravings for specific foods. They may eat more than they try to intend to, and they eat to the point of feeling uncomfortably full. This creates feelings of guilt and shame about their eating behaviors, similarly to somebody who uses drugs and alcohol. While we do know that food addiction is associated with being overweight or obese, these can cause similar medical risks of those who struggle with obesity.